The message arrived on a Tuesday, transmitted through the radio telescope array at Arecibo's successor facility in Chile. Dr. Isabella Romano had been analyzing deep space signals for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for this. The message was clear, coherent, and terrifying. They're coming. We couldn't stop them. Prepare yourselves. Within hours, every major observatory on Earth confirmed the presence of massive objects moving through the Kuiper Belt. They weren't meteors or comets. They moved with purpose, adjusting their trajectory with precision that could only be artificial. The objects were crystalline in nature, reflecting light in ways that made them seem to shimmer like diamonds in the void. Director Romano, the UN Security Council is waiting, Lieutenant Raj Patil announced, standing at attention in the doorway of her office. Isabella nodded, gathering her tablet and the printouts of the latest calculations. As she walked through the facility's corridors, she couldn't help but think about how surreal the past 48 hours had been. The Security Council chamber was packed when she arrived, but not with the usual politicians and diplomats. Instead, a holographic projection dominated the center of the room, showing beings that defied human understanding. They called themselves the Galactic Council, and their news was grim. The Quirksians are unlike anything your species has encountered, explained Ambassador Zix, their form shifting between various geometric patterns as they spoke. They are crystalline entities that consume minerals and metals to reproduce. They've devoured 17 civilizations in the past millennium alone. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. Isabella studied the data streaming alongside the hologram, composition analyses, movement patterns, and energy signatures. Something about the Quirksians' crystalline nature tugged at her scientific mind, but she couldn't quite grasp it yet. Why warn us? General Huang asked, her voice cutting through the chaos. Your message indicated we're considered a primitive world by your standards. The ambassador's form pulsed with what might have been embarrassment. It is our policy to warn developing worlds of extinction-level threats. The Quirksians, they are particularly efficient. We've never found a way to stop them completely. Isabella's hand shot up, a detail catching her attention. These readings, their crystalline structure appears to be silicon-based, but with unusual thermal properties. Have you tried? We've attempted every known weapon, interrupted another council member. Their crystal matrix adapts and strengthens. Conventional attacks are useless. But Isabella wasn't listening anymore. Her mind raced through her university days, to a particular experiment in the materials science lab. Crystal structures, thermal shock, coefficient of expansion. What about butter? She asked suddenly. The entire chamber fell silent. Even the holographic council members seemed to freeze in confusion. I apologize, Dr. Romano, Ambassador Zix said carefully, but did you suggest using a dairy product against the most dangerous threat in the galaxy? Isabella stood, her fingers flying across her tablet. Not the butter itself, the principle. Look at these thermal readings. The Quirksians maintain their crystalline structure within a narrow temperature range. What if we didn't try to destroy them through force, but through rapid temperature change? She projected her own data alongside the council's. On Earth, we use thermal shock to break down materials all the time. Pour hot butter on cold ice cream. The ice cream cracks. Pour cold water on hot glass. It shatters. Their very strength, their rigid crystalline structure, could be their weakness. General Huang leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Are you suggesting we fight an advanced alien species with the same principle we use to crack creme brulee? Exactly, Isabella replied, growing more excited. But on a massive scale. We don't need advanced weapons. We need temperature differentials. Massive ones. And Earth, with our varying climates, our technology for both heating and cooling, our experience with thermal engineering. We might be uniquely suited to fight this enemy. The Galactic Council's holograms flickered as they consulted with each other. Finally, Ambassador Zix spoke. In 15,000 years of fighting the Quirksians, No species has ever suggested such an approach. It's primitive, unprecedented. They paused. It might just work. As the chamber burst into activity, with military leaders and scientists already beginning to plan, Isabella couldn't help but smile. Humanity might be considered primitive by galactic standards, but sometimes the simplest solutions were the best ones. The Quirksians were about to learn that underestimating Earth could be a fatal mistake. And somewhere in the void of space, the crystalline fleet continued its approach, unaware that their greatest weakness had been discovered by a species that still enjoyed putting hot fudge on cold ice cream. General Huang stood at the window of the newly established Thermal Defense Command, watching as massive heat exchangers were installed across the Nevada desert. 3 months had passed since Dr. Romano's breakthrough, and humanity had moved with unprecedented unity and speed. The Russians have completed their cold fusion arrays in Siberia, Lieutenant Podol reported, sliding a tablet across the command table. And the Sahara Solar Initiative is ahead of schedule. The general nodded, her mind on the latest intelligence. The Quirksians had already passed Mars, their crystalline ships refracting sunlight like deadly prisms across space. Earth had perhaps 2 weeks left. "Show me the latest test results," she ordered. The main screen lit up with footage from the Australian Outback testing facility. A captured Quirksian scout crystal, barely the size of a car, sat in a reinforced chamber. Scientists had discovered these advanced scouts were sent to analyze planetary compositions. The test began. Superheated plasma from solar collectors hit one side of the crystal, while liquid nitrogen sprayers targeted the other. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like chiming bells, cracks appeared across the crystal's surface. Within seconds, it shattered into thousands of pieces. "Beautiful," Dr. Romano said from the doorway. She looked exhausted but triumphant. "The thermal differential was only half of what we can achieve with the full arrays. But the larger ships will be more resistant," General Huang reminded her. "And they'll learn from each engagement. That's why we're not using just one approach." Isabella pulled up new schematics. "We're calling it the butter knife protocol. Multiple thermal shock vectors from different sources, heat rays from the Sahara arrays, cold beams from the Antarctic stations, and mobile thermal units we're calling hot pockets." A younger officer stifled a laugh at the name, but General Huang smiled. "Let them laugh." The absurdity of fighting advanced aliens with what amounted to glorified heating and cooling units was not lost on her. The Galactic Council had been both horrified and fascinated by humanity's preparations. Their own civilizations had spent millennia developing energy weapons and force fields, only to watch Earth weaponize basic thermodynamics. "We've also discovered something interesting," Isabella continued. "The Quirksian crystals don't just break. They sing. Each fracture produces specific frequencies. We think it's part of their communication system." "You want to weaponize their screams?" Lieutenant Patil asked, looking slightly ill. "Not exactly. But understanding their harmonic frequencies might help us target their weak points. Every crystal has natural resonance. Hit the right frequency while applying thermal shock." The general raised her hand, interrupting. "Save the technical details. Will it work?" Isabella met her gaze steadily. "It has to. Because if it doesn't, Earth becomes their next buffet." Across the planet, preparations continued. The Amazon basin was converted into a massive steam generator. The Siberian tundra housed cooling arrays that could flash freeze small lakes. Every major desert now bristled with solar collectors that could focus the sun's heat with surgical precision. Humanity had transformed their entire planet into a weapon based on the simplest principles of physics. Traditional military leaders had scoffed initially, but the test results were undeniable. The same forces that could crack a frozen glass under hot water could shatter a Quirksian warship, if amplified enough. The final piece came from an unexpected source. A Canadian ice cream manufacturer suggested using rapidly alternating heat and cold rather than simultaneous application. The ice cream headache protocol, as it was dubbed, proved 3 times more effective in tests. As the deadline approached, humanity waited. Their cities had been partially evacuated, their military forces repositioned around the thermal arrays. Traditional weapons remained as backup, but everyone knew they would be useless against the crystalline invaders. General Huang made her final inspection of the command center. Status report. Sahara arrays at 100% capacity. Siberian coolers primed. South Pole thermal lance charge. All hot pockets deployed and in position. Lieutenant Patel's voice was steady, professional. Dr. Romano. Any last-minute adjustments? Isabella shook her head, watching the tactical display where the Craxian fleet grew ever larger. The physics is sound. Now we just have to hope they're as vulnerable to brain freeze as we are. Above them, the crystalline ships entered the outer atmosphere, their surfaces beginning to glow with entered heat. They had no idea they were descending into the galaxy's largest thermal trap, designed by a species that had mastered the art of temperature control before they'd even reached the stars. The invasion was about to begin, and humanity's kitchen-inspired defense was ready to serve up a very nasty surprise. The first Craxian ship entered Earth's atmosphere at 3:47 GMT, its crystalline surface refracting the dawn over Asia into spectacular, deadly rainbows. Within minutes, 4 more followed, their formation suggesting a standard invasion pattern. "They're taking the bait," General Huan whispered, watching as the ships descended toward the carefully prepared landing zones. Each zone was surrounded by thermal arrays, disguised as industrial complexes. The largest ship, nearly 2 kilometers of living crystal, settled over the Australian outback. Its surface rippled, smaller crystals beginning to detach. The first wave of ground forces. "All stations, execute ice cream headache protocol," the general ordered. "Time to serve our guests." The attack began with sublime simplicity. Concentrated solar beams from the Sahara arrays struck the crystalline vessels from multiple angles, heating their surfaces to near melting point. Before the ships could adapt, the Siberian coolers fired, flash freezing the superheated crystal. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The smallest ship shattered first, its surface fracturing with a sound like a million wine glasses breaking simultaneously. The crystalline shards fell like deadly rain, but they too were caught in the alternating waves of heat and cold, breaking down into harmless dust. But the Craxians weren't the galaxy's most feared species for nothing. The remaining ships quickly adapted, generating protective fields that attempted to regulate their temperature. "Shifting to Phase 2, Dr. Romano announced. Activating the resonance arrays. Across the globe, specialized transmitters began broadcasting frequencies matched to the Craxians' natural harmonics. The crystalline ships vibrated, their protective fields fluctuating as they tried to maintain stability. "Hot pockets, you have a go," General Huang commanded. Mobile thermal units, looking like bizarre hybrid tanks, moved into position. They fired concentrated beams of alternating heat and cold, synchronized with the resonance broadcasts. The combination proved devastating. 2 more ships cracked, their fragments singing discordant harmonies as they fell. But the largest vessel, the one over Australia, was proving more resilient. "They're adapting faster than predicted," Isabella warned, studying the readings. "The crystalline structure is becoming more flexible, absorbing the thermal shock. Then we'll give them something bigger to absorb." The general turned to Lieutenant Patel. "Initialize the magma tap." Deep beneath the Australian desert, engineers had spent months drilling into the Earth's crust, creating a direct line to the planet's molten core. With a series of controlled explosions, they released a massive upwelling of magma, directly beneath the Craxian flagship. The superheated rock shot upward at tremendous pressure, while simultaneously, the Antarctic thermal lance fired its cold beam. The temperature differential was beyond anything they tested. The Craxian ship's surface began to splinter, but instead of breaking apart, it started to reform, adapting to the extreme conditions. "Impossible," Isabella breathed. "They're using the energy differential to power some kind of regeneration process." The ship's new configuration was even more alien, a crystalline structure that seemed to flow like liquid while maintaining its solid form. Smaller crystals began raining down, but these weren't fragments. They were soldiers. All ground forces, engage, General Wang ordered. But maintain distance. Let the thermal weapons do their work. The battle that followed was unlike anything in human military history. Crystal beings that towered 3 meters high advanced across the Australian desert, only to be met by mobile hot pockets firing precision thermal blasts. When direct attacks proved less effective, the human forces adapted, using the environment itself as a weapon. They lured Craxian troops into water traps, then flash froze the liquid. They created artificial sandstorms, superheating the particles to create a natural thermal abrading effect. Each tactic worked once or twice before the crystalline soldiers adapted, but humanity had plenty of tricks left. As the sun set over the battlefield, the situation had reached a stalemate. The remaining Craxian ship hung in the sky, its new form seemingly impervious to their original tactics. The ground forces had taken losses but were learning, evolving their structure with each engagement. In the command center, Dr. Romano worked furiously at her console, analyzing the new Craxian configuration. Something about their adaptation process nagged at her scientific mind. They weren't just changing their structure. They were changing the fundamental way they interacted with temperature. "General," she said suddenly, "I think I know why they're called the Craxians now. Look at these patterns. They're not just crystalline beings. They're living heat exchanges." Meaning? Meaning we've been thinking too small. We've been trying to break them with temperature differences. But what if we remove temperature itself from the equation? General Huang's eyes widened as she understood. You want to create a zero-point field. The energy requirements would be massive. Yes, but we have the entire planet's power grid at our disposal. Isabella was already running calculations, and we have something else they don't expect. What's that? The human capacity for absolute overkill. As night fell over the battlefield, both sides regrouped and adapted. The first round had proven that humanity's primitive thermal weapons could hurt the mighty Craxians. But it had also shown that their enemy was far more adaptable than anyone had anticipated. The real test would come with dawn, and humanity's desperate plan to remove temperature itself from the equation. As Dr. Romano had pointed out, if you can't win the game, change the rules entirely. High above, the crystalline ship shimmered in the moonlight, its new form a testament to the Craxians' resilience. But it had yet to face humanity's greatest weapon, their absolute refusal to accept defeat, even in the face of impossible odds. The battle for Earth was far from over, and tomorrow would bring an escalation that neither side had anticipated. The zero-point field generators hummed to life as dawn broke over the Australian desert. Every power plant on Earth had been redirected to this single, desperate gambit. The plan was theoretically simple: create a zone of absolute zero temperature, a place where molecular motion itself ceased. Field initialization at 15%. Lieutenant Puddle reported, his voice tense. Craxian forces are responding. The crystalline soldiers had resumed their advance, but differently now. They moved in complex formations, their structures constantly shifting between solid and quasi-liquid states. They'd learned from yesterday's battles, adapted to handle extreme temperature changes. They haven't learned everything, Dr. Romano muttered, watching the readings. Field at 25%. The air itself began to crystallize as the temperature dropped beyond anything naturally possible on Earth. The Craxian ground forces slowed, their shifting forms becoming more erratic. But the mothership above had other plans. It released a new type of crystal, darker and more angular. These hit the ground and began drilling, burrowing deep into the Earth. They're trying to tap the planet's heat for themselves, Isabella realized, attempting to counter our zero-point field with geothermal energy. Not on my planet, General Wang snarled. Initialize the Pangaea Protocol. Across the globe, specially placed seismic charges detonated in precise sequences. The resulting vibrations weren't meant to destroy. They were designed to harmonize, creating standing waves through the Earth's crust that disrupted the Craxians' drilling attempts. The battle had evolved beyond simple thermal warfare. It was now a complex dance of physics, with both sides trying to control the fundamental forces of nature itself. Field at 40%, Patel announced. But power grid stability is becoming critical. In cities worldwide, the lights went dark. Humanity had thrown everything into this gambit, betting their entire civilization on this one shot at victory. The Craxian mothership descended lower, its new liquid crystal form rippling with internal energy. It seemed to sense the threat of the zero-point field, but rather than retreat, it pressed forward. "They're attempting to overload the field generators," Isabella warned. "The energy output from their ship is off the charts." "Then let's give them more charts to go off of." General Huang opened a global channel. "All thermal arrays, maximum power, everything we have left." The Australian desert became ground zero for the most extreme energy exchange in Earth's history. The zero-point field pushed toward absolute zero from one direction, while every thermal weapon humanity had built poured heat in from others. The Craxian mothership found itself caught in a war between physics itself. Absolute zero on one side, solar concentrated heat on the other, while seismic waves disrupted their attempts to ground themselves. "Field at 75%, Patel called out. "Grid failure imminent in multiple sectors." The crystalline ship's surface began to fracture, but differently than before. Instead of breaking apart, it was transforming, trying to adapt to conditions that should have been physically impossible. "They're attempting to phase shift," Isabella announced, her eyes wide. "They're trying to exist in multiple states simultaneously." "Can they do that?" "Theoretically, no. Practically." She gestured at the screens. "They're rewiring physics as we know it." But the Craxians had made one critical mistake. In their desperation to adapt to every extreme humanity threw at them, they'd stretched their adaptability too thin. "Field at 90%, Paddle reported. "Total grid failure in 3 minutes." The mothership's surface had become something impossible. Parts solid, parts liquid, parts somewhere in between. It was adapting to everything, which meant it was no longer perfectly adapted to anything. "Now," Isabella whispered, "hit them with everything. All of it. At once." General Huang gave the order. Every remaining weapon Earth had left fired simultaneously. Heat, cold, sonic resonance, seismic waves. A full-spectrum assault on an enemy trying to exist in too many states at once. The result defied description. The Craxian ship seemed to fold in on itself, its too-adapted structure collapsing under the weight of its own impossible configurations. The crystal soldiers below froze, their connections to the mothership severed. "Field generators failing," Patel announced. "Grid collapse in 30 seconds." "They don't need to last 30 seconds, Isabella said quietly, watching the cascade failure spread through the Craxian forces. "It's already over." The mothership didn't explode, didn't shatter like its smaller companions had. Instead, it crystallized one final time, becoming a perfect, motionless statue in the sky. Then, with a sound like wind through crystal caves, it began to rain down as harmless dust. As the zero-point field collapsed and Earth's power grid went dark, the Australian desert glittered with the remnants of the most advanced species humanity had ever faced. They had come expecting to find a primitive world, easy prey for their superior adaptation. Instead, they'd found a species willing to break physics itself to defend their home. In the darkness of the powered-down command center, General Huang turned to Dr. Romano. "How long until we can restore power?" "Hours, maybe days." Isabella was already working on her backup tablet. "But I'm more interested in studying this dust. The Craxians didn't just adapt to temperature, they adapted to adaptation itself, the implications for materials science alone." "Always the scientist," the general smiled, "even after saving the world." "Especially after saving the world," Isabella corrected, "because now we know what's out there. And next time, we'll be ready with more than just hot and cold." As dawn fully broke over the battlefield, Earth began to recover from its greatest victory. They had done what no other species had managed in 15,000 years, defeated the Craxians. And they'd done it by being exactly what the galaxy considered them. Primitive enough to think of using temperature itself as a weapon, yet advanced enough to push that simple idea to its absolute limit. The galaxy would never look at Earth the same way again. The Galactic Council's emergency session was unlike any in its 15,000-year history. For the first time, representatives from Earth, a supposedly primitive world, stood before the assembled species as equals. More than equals, as saviors. Dr. Isabella Romano and General Huang stood calmly as the Council's